The project I'm most working on at the moment is water in Bangladesh, where there's tens of millions of people who don't have water, and looking at working with people on how do you solve that at scale. So I'm always interested in what can we do about a project at the scale of the problem we're trying to solve, not at the scale of our imagination. And so today I'm going to use a permaculture lens at looking at. So I've given a workshop like this a couple of times before, but not with the permaculture lens, so I'm kind of flipping it around a bit. And we'll start off with what I think of as the anti-pattern. Right? This is all the other patterns are positive, but this one for me is the anti-pattern. Because if we've got the most perfect permy backyard, but for every one of our backyards, there's hundreds of thousands of acres of Monsanto Roundup soy in it, then we aren't changing anything. In fact, the change is moving faster in the wrong direction. If we've got the off-grid zero energy house, but it's the only one in the suburb and everyone else is driving around SUVs, we ain't doing nothing. And on the bigger scale, if Australia gets its domestic emissions down to zero, we are still the most polluting country in the world almost, because our export emissions are 3 or 4 times what we burn locally, because every ton of coal we dig out the ground and ship overseas is a ton that turns into CO2. So how do we do stuff at the scale of the problem? How do we set size and speed as a goal when we're doing our project design right from the beginning? Right? Throw out this principle and keep all the rest. So speed, the one constant in all of history, ever since we were amino acids floating in a primordial soup, is that speed speeds up. That everything is happening faster and faster and faster. And that's largely because every tool we build, whether it was amino acids coming together to form DNA, single-celled organisms becoming multi-celled organisms, developing sexual reproduction, all the way forward to the electricity, the phone, the internet, AI. Each tool we build makes it easier to build the next one. And that pushes speed, whether we like it or not. So we can all say we want to slow down, and our personal life, absolutely agree, it's a great idea. But if we don't do things at the speed that the rest of the world is changing, the rest of the world still changes. We can change our backyard, but if climate change wipes out any ability to grow crops there, we've got to do things quicker. So the question is, can we responsibly make decisions at the speed of change? I think we've seen with politics. We've known for 20 years, 40 years, that climate change is a major, major disaster. We still can't make decisions because we've got governments that think on 4-year timescales. And that's going to become even worse because our patterns of making decisions haven't speeded up, while the ability to create negative decisions has. So if, again, it's the question is, what happens if we don't do anything? The other thing I love from Hannah's talk, and happens to be here as well, is can we focus on the solutions rather than the problems? Because when we stand in front of the bulldozers, what we do is slow the bulldozers down till the cops arrive. Right? We have to come up with alternative solutions. We have to build the positive that people can switch to. So there's no need to go chop down that forest. Okay, speed and scale come with tons of problems. And I could have done an entire talk on what goes wrong in big projects, including ones I've been involved with. I was part of the original design of some of the internet stuff. The stuff you use every day, I was part of designing. And we can all see how the internet has been both a positive and a negative. So we have to be super aware of this. We have to be super aware of how do we retain the ethics of permaculture as we do things on a large scale. The solutions at scale do not have to be big, obnoxious, unethical corporations. There's lots of other ways to do that, which I'll get into in a minute. And I hope it, obviously we've got people still coming in, so I'm not going to go back to the beginning, but I think you're getting the point. I'm going to repeat it a bunch of times. My intention, by the way, today is to do a fairly quick talk and then break us up into 4 groups and start looking at this on some of our own projects. So we'll see how that goes. So the kind of questions I like to ask is, what problems work well at scale? So let me just do a show of hands. How many of you are working on a project already that you'd be interested in figuring out how to scale? Right, about a third, half-ish. How many of you are thinking a project you haven't started which you'd like to think about doing big? Another bunch. And how many of you are looking for a good idea of a project to do? Few. Okay, so with some duplicates, that's great. So this first few slides is looking at what kind of things work well at scale. Observe and interact, we all know that principle. The problem is often the solution. If we look around us, we see massive inefficiencies in government, in companies, and even in permaculture. We see systems in all those three environments that we're familiar with that work, we see things that don't work. Things that work really, really badly are often good opportunities for disruption. And I'm going to use some examples later of how we did this at scale in different places. But what we're looking for is anti-patterns. Things which are consistently bad, like government ability to react quickly. That's a place for potential disruption. It's a place for opportunity because they also can't react to your disruption quickly. The other place I like to think about is, for looking for solutions, is edges. Because edges, just as in permaculture, are often the places where, when we dig in, there's an opportunity to do something. Let me give a couple of examples. The first organisation I started, which became the peak body for digital human rights, it's in 70 countries now. We worked at the edges between emerging internet technologies and the desire for activists to communicate. When we bridged those edges, there was an opportunity to do something at scale. But we were people who were both activists and techies. And so we bridged that with an early internet provider. Here, does anyone here remember Pegasus? Mm-hmm. That was based on the stuff I did. So we worked with them from the day they started, and I'll talk more about them later. So we bridged that edge. Lumita was the company I worked on which did solar in tens of thousands of houses across Africa. We bridged the edges between manufacturers who were making fairly high quality, cheap solar systems, mostly in Germany and China, between local solar companies right across Africa, locally owned, locally managed solar companies, and between the phone companies who had developed payment networks. We developed a small piece of technology, I've got one somewhere but I'll find it later, a chip that manufacturers could put in their devices. We then sold software to local local solar companies, and we tied it into the phone companies' payment networks. Bridging those three edges, none of them could do it on their own, even any pair of organizations couldn't do it. By bridging all three, we created something that scaled to tens of thousands of houses. In our space, I would suggest that regen agriculture is a really good edge, because there's an edge there between people who know about how to feed lots of people and ecosystems. So regen ag is this edge between productivity and ecosystem. So there's a potential to scale things there. So I'm interested, anyone who's put their hand up at any point, what edges are any of you working on? Can you think of what you're doing in terms of an edge?
The edge between conventional decorative gardens and edible gardens.
Right, so making edible gardens beautiful.
Yeah, well, encouraging people who want beautiful gardens to grow edible gardens.
Right. Someone else?
Community verge gardening.
Yeah, it's a great edge.
I'm working on an edge between traditional urban planning and permaculture.
Nice, okay. So, another hand.
Yeah, the edge between people who, like empty nesters, people who've got mostly empty houses, and people who need houses that don't have them and can't afford them, and bringing permaculture into
Cool. And it's nice how a lot of those also come back into the last thing I said, where the problem is the solution. The empty nester with the room is the solution to the problem of the person looking for cheap housing. The verge is a problem for the council because they have to maintain it. When you take it over and put gardens in there, it's less maintenance for them. Another place to look for edges is waste. There is tons of waste out there. Waste is often the opportunity. Let me give you an example. I created a company, this was back in 2005, 6-ish, in solar. And at the time, people were installing, how many people put solar in about the mid-2000s when there was the first government rebate scheme, the 1 kilowatt rebate scheme? Right, very few people. That's because you're down here in South Australia and we didn't do anything in South Australia. If I did this in New South Wales, half the hands would have gone up. Right. What we did was solar was being sold for about 14,500 per 1 kilowatt system in those days. We looked at this massive waste in the solar industry in Australia at the time. I mean, the typical solar company was do a quote on Monday, get stoned on Tuesday, install it on Wednesday, get stoned on Thursday, and do the paperwork on Friday. I mean, that was the typical, it was a lifestyle business, and very, very few solar systems were going in. And they were buying down this long supply chain, which meant that by the time you bought it, it cost you 14,500, and there was $9,000 worth of subsidy. So you were $5,500 out of pocket, and most of us don't have $5,500 sitting around. The payback time was really long. We looked at that and said, well, what would happen if we did this at scale? What would happen if we took all that waste out of the system? So we went to the factories in China and said, what happens if we buy solar panels from you by the cargo container? We went to manufacturers in Germany and said, what happens if we buy more inverters from you than your Australian distributors currently buying an entire year? We looked at all the inefficiencies where people were doing 10 quotes for every system they installed, adding $1,000 to the cost in quotes. Because they were doing a lot of quotes and people weren't buying them, and they were doing quotes that so were their competitors. So really, really expensive. We knocked the price down from 14,500 to 9,500. We knocked 30% off the price. Now you may remember I said there was a $9,000 subsidy. So we sold 1 kilowatt solar systems for $500. And, right, because 9,500 of which the government gives us back 9,000, so we took 500 off you and we handled the rest.
Oh, I was saying, how come I didn't know that?
Because the way we did it was we realised the only way to do it at that scale was to do it in specific areas. And to get 50 houses in a neighbourhood to buy at the same time, because then an electrician goes up one roof, puts stuff off, and then they come down off that roof, walk to the next house and put it back on there. And so that meant we took all that waste out of the system. We did $20 million worth of business in 2 years, from scratch, from starting. Right? You can do projects at scale. You've got to find some other people, look for an opportunity like that, and do it. Anybody thinking waste in an area they're looking at for work? No projects around waste? Okay. Yes.
Well, yeah, but it's invisible waste. Like it's individual groups working on their own thing without those interconnections.
Right.
So we're trying to just be the bridge, like you were talking about.
Well, what kind of project?
Well, we're calling it regeneration in the Canberra region.
Yeah.
And it's not a project. Like the project is to have those groups talk to each other and support and sustain.
Right. So there's probably a lot of waste of people doing the same thing.
Exactly.
There's a similar problem. I'm involved in intentional community stuff, and then in Australia we've got intentional communities. We've got the Global Eco Village Network, and we've got co-housing network. They're all duplicating work. There's not really enough.
Yeah.
You know, they're all duplicating the same set of things.
Yeah.
If they work together, they could probably be a lot bigger, a lot more effective. So, I spoke earlier about going to scale does not mean creating a megalithic corporation necessarily. And I want to just play around with a few ideas about what kind of structures can be done at scale, just so we realise we're not talking about creating a publicly listed company necessarily. So this is kind of the traditional scale route. The green is always us in this case. You develop something, you find people to sell it to, they sell it to the end people. Right? That's what we're doing in Bangladesh with water. Right? That's us. We sell filters to people, to distributors. Distributors sell it to the little store on the corner. There's actually another layer there. And the little store on the corner means it's available in every village. This is a very traditional way of doing things. And of course, what this means is the people you work with are distributors. So each of these, you end up working with different kinds of partners, because going to scale, you never, ever, ever do it on your own. It's all about who your partners are. Right? One of the current models that a lot of people are doing is B2C. I mean, and if you think of our solar company, that was B2C. In B2C, you develop something and you sell it to people directly. Now, the only way to do that is to figure out how to make that process as frictionless as possible, right? Because you need to deal with every customer for less cost than this kind of model does. But that gets easier and easier. So instead of working with distributors, what you're working with in the B2C model is you're working with other services. You're working with web designers, you're working with social media influencers, you're working with warehousing services. You're taking all the bits that you would do and looking at the people who do that professionally and building that kind of model. That was how, let's say, Beyond Building Energy, BBE, did it, which was we worked directly with customers. We eliminated those chains because those chains, especially in old, well-established industries, are often the source of the waste because they're marking it up at every level in that chain. And often, these days, not doing much. Right? A third method is partnering. So back in the 80s when I created GreenNet, we kept getting pestered by people in other countries who wanted communications in their countries, not just in the UK. And so what we did was we looked out there and we said, who else around the world is trying to do what we're doing and not succeeding? Where are we seeing people who are both activists and techies trying to solve the problem but not getting there? Now, how can we capacity build them? How can we bring them up to our scale? Right, and Pegasus in Australia was one of the ones we identified and we brought them up to be an equal partner. So the key is trying to bring other people up to be equal partners so that then you start working together on the things that you all share. And that's a good model if let's say you're running say a repair cafe in one city and you want to do that, you want to scale it. Well, you're not going to make a bigger repair cafe because you don't need more stuff. What you're going to do is say, how can I establish a repair cafe in the 3 cities around me? Help them understand how we do it, and then maybe we buy some tools that we move around 1 week here, 1 week there, 1 week there, or stuff like that. You figure ways, and what you typically do is you end up creating another little organisation above you, a small organisation that does the stuff that's common to all of you. So once in APC we went from 2 countries, which was UK and US, to 7 countries in 1 year. We Brazil, Nicaragua, Australia, Russia, I'm forgetting what the 5th one was, but we went to 7 countries. And then all those countries started contributing to a fund, which then funded stuff that was done on behalf of everybody. So that when we had a software project, we would do it once, we would all fund it. And then we started it where that peak body, which is essentially, we didn't know the word peak body at the time, but it's essentially a peak body, would go and get grants from international organisations. So it might go and get a grant on how do you improve women's access to the internet in countries where it's not traditional, right? Which is one of the grants they got from the UN. They got a massive grant. Then they went to all the different member organisations and said, okay, now you can implement it. So they were able to go to the UN as an organisation with offices in 70 countries and do a project at really, really big scale. I like to say this is also part of the valuing diversity principle, because what made that work was because we were integrating people from very, very different cultures. So we had very different approaches to how to work, to activism and stuff like that. It was both the challenge and the opportunity of the APC, which is, I say, it's still going. This final one is kind of an interesting one, because this is what we did at Limiter. Facilitation is where you make things happen. You don't actually sell something to somebody. You make it happen. You're the people that go in there and draw those dots, draw those lines between the edges. So at Lumita, we made a chip, we sold it to manufacturers, we made some software that tied to the phone companies for the payment systems, and then we worked with the retailers, but nobody bought, the solar systems weren't sold by us. The African companies bought the solar systems from the manufacturers, and they could choose from competing manufacturers. And we just made it all happen. And we got paid for doing that. We got paid about $5 a system for making it happen. and that was enough for us to do something at, say, a very large scale, tens of thousands of houses.
Excuse me. Who gave you the $5?
The
providers.
The manufacturers gave us a couple of bucks for the chip, and the people in the companies in Africa gave us a few dollars to access the software.
Right.
Right. And that's on a $200 system. So it was a. These those small solar systems that you plug 4 lights into and a phone charger. It was those kind of systems. So it was sold to very poor customers for $200 over 2 years.
Wow.
So $2 a week, which is their ability to pay. But if you're doing something which is $200 over 2 years and 100 payments, you better have a very, very low cost of managing those payments, which is what we enabled them to do. So again, this is the permaculture principle of collaboration and integration. How do you look at the people who are doing part of the problem you're trying to solve, and then figure out how to integrate them together so that you solve the problem? None of them could do it on their own. All right, So when we're putting a project together, there's a few kind of meta designs. There's lots more than this, but these are just a few of them, of the kinds of things we need to think about as we put stuff together. And I'm just picking them from the permaculture principles, like valuing renewable resources and services, asking the question, what is out there that you can tap? Now, you only have a certain amount of resources yourself, but there's tons of stuff out there that is free and available. Obviously, solar energy is one of them, but I'm thinking in terms of what's out there in your community. So at Beyond Building, what we did was we enabled local people who wanted to get cheap solar to go and find 49 neighbours. Our renewable resource was the people who wanted solar and had a great desire to get it and were willing to go and knock on all their neighbours' doors in order to get a cheap deal for themselves. Right? That was a renewable resource. The one thing that's not a renewable resource is grants. Right? Grants do not scale with the project. You'll get the grant the first time, and a grant's a totally valid way to get something started. But it's not a renewable resource. You've got to look at what are the resources out there. It might be waste. It might be, the Earthships. Who saw the Earthships film yet last night? The renewable resource they're using is tyres to build walls. So there's resources out there. What resources can you use to make your project happen? The next question, meta design element is like, how do you obtain a yield? Like, and the way I look at a yield is, what are you getting out of each thing you do that is more than what it costs you to do it? So if we take the water example, there's tons of people out there that can provide people with clean drinking water in a place like Bangladesh for 2 cents a litre. Great, that sounds, why don't we do that? Well, the problem is the people in Bangladesh who don't have water, the median ability to pay is 1 cent a litre, which means that every litre of water you delivered would have to be subsidised. So if you want to reach 10 million people who don't have litres, don't have water, that's a couple of 100,000 litres a day, 20 million litres a day, which is $200,000 per day subsidy needed. Ain't going to happen. Right? If you can flip it round and obtain a yield by delivering water to people for 1 cent, where your cost is significantly less than that, you've got a yield. And going back to our model of, we're selling down a supply chain, that's a yield at every point in that chain. Right? The distributors have to make money, the guy running the store on the corner has to make money, and we do manufacturing. If we can do that, we can scale indefinitely. We need grants to get going because we've got people on the ground when we're selling only a few and we're trying it all out. But if grants is our long-term version of the yield, it's not going to scale. Right? Use grants to get yourselves to a point where you're generating more money from what you're doing than it costs you to provide it.
you talking about grants in the form of a seed, like seed money, or
Exactly.
just a
Yeah, for
micro
example.
investment?
I mean, a lot of the things that are wanted, whether it's sustainability or water in Bangladesh,
Yeah.
there are people out there who are willing to put money into
Yeah.
as grants, but they're just not willing to do it at the scale.
Well, so I'm asking that because sometimes grants come with so much strings attached to them, work.
Yes,
It's actually costs you, right?
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So you don't get a yield from that grant.
Yeah.
That's the classic problem.
The idea of using the grant to get to where it becomes self-sustaining is the same as the proper use of appropriate technology. You're using the technology to get to a system that will sustain itself, but the use of that technology, that's not like the permanent solution. It's like
Yeah,
to
yeah,
get you there.
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so the question when you're designing a project is how can you design a project so that everybody who plays in that is seeing some part of that yield. And then go on.
I'm just concerned that technology is a flawed ingredient in a lot of international projects, and there's a lot of projects that leave technology breakdowns unresolved, and the water system doesn't end up working, and
Totally.
the telephone system doesn't end up.
Yeah.
And this sort of whole institutional thinking that we can go into a community that's been in its role for 110,000 years, worrying about digging the well, or how they do communications, how they do local watershed management. These sort of big things are full of local conversations and local management capacities and warfare, and it's very difficult to place a technological solution there that's going to survive.
Absolutely. And that's not really addressed here, but it's a key problem of how you design things. Our staff on the water project, it's entirely Bangladeshi. It's run by the Bangladeshis. That's our solution. Like a filter sold in local stores. You can open it.
So this just goes on their water jug,
Exactly.
and they put their muddy water and it comes out
drinkable.
drinkable.
Yes. Right. Because the wells already exist in Bangladesh because the water table is very high. The wells are there. They're just not being water.
And they've got the
And people get really sick. It's 50% of the hospital. 50% of hospital beds in Bangladesh are full with people who got their disease through waterborne. And Bangladesh is not unusual in that respect.
How long does the filters last for?
20 litres.
20 years.
20 litres.
20 litres.
So they're 30 Australian cents for 20 litres. So I think American, because I work internationally, so it's 20 US cents or 1 cent a litre. And so the catching and storing energy one is another part of it. When you're building a big thing, you're building from small steps usually, and you've got to get to big, which means you've got to catch some of that yield. You've got to start moving that around. That yield's not necessarily money. So for this water project, the yield on our initial projects is credibility. Right? We go out there, we do some advertising in one district, we see sales, we then go to the people we're looking at for grants and say, well, look, we've shown it works. Now give us some money to prove it at the next scale. We prove it at the next scale, we develop credibility, we get some more grants. We then hit the point where we're at the scale where we're now financially viable, and then we can get a distributor to take it. And then we can step out of the job of moving truckloads of filters around, because there's people who move truckloads of stuff around to these stores every day. So that's this, how do you design a pattern that scales up, that spirals up, using the yield from one stage to drive the next stage? I'm part of a repair cafe in the Mullumbimby area. Before the floods, we were 4 people on a back porch. Right? During the floods, we went from 4 people once a week to 30 people every day. We developed a huge amount of credibility. That was our yield. Right? So we didn't make any money from taking washing machines off the street, fixing them and giving them away again. We covered our expenses from a donation jar. We didn't make any money, but our yield was incredible credibility. That credibility allowed us to get a very large shed. So we can now do that and run other courses teaching people how to use, mostly teaching women how to use tools actually is what happens in that shed. So we
Could you
used,
scale that up Australia-wide, please?
of course it could. Of course it could, because most repair cafes don't seem to be thinking at scale, unfortunately. So that's the, The other part, thinking about patterns, and you raised it earlier when we talk about what are wells that don't work, right? Is you're making decisions quickly, you're going to make wrong decisions. How do you develop ways of learning from what you're doing and iterating? You know, you planted a tree in the wrong place. Figure that out before the tree's too big to move. Same here. Like, so, a couple of examples from this. At Lumita, with the solar company in Africa, it was our third product that worked. Our first two products did not match what the market needed. Right, so at some point we had to throw away a lot of time and energy developing them because they didn't do what was needed. It was only our third one that took off. So we had to interact with people out there, learn what we were doing wrong, and then figure out what was needed. But the other part of that is, that's external feedback. The other part you've got to do if you're going to do something quickly is get really good at internal feedback. Right? Because whoever's managing it is usually going to be outside their capability. Right? So you've got to build on the skills of all the people in the team. And another Lumita example for that was we hired this Indian woman, 25-year-old Indian woman, to be our head of sales for India. We took a big risk on her. I happened luckily to be at a conference when I heard she was looking for a job, and we gave her a job managing sales in India. And we said, okay, so now can you also do a little bit in Africa and help us get started in Africa? We had lots of inquiries in India. Help us get started in Africa as well, and help us hire someone for Africa. She calls me back a month later. She's like the most junior person in the company, and she says, I'm not making any sales in India, and I think it's because of the market, not me. Right? And I had to have we had to have the ability within our organisation to listen to people, even the people at the bottom, and say, maybe you're right. Maybe India's not the right market. And she asked us to move her to Nairobi, which we did, and she shone, right? Because Africa turned out to be our market, not India. So you got to listen. You've got to develop really good feedback things where you don't make somebody wrong if they make a mistake and then come back and report it, you fix it, so you can develop those feedback loops. A lot of organisations do that really, really badly, and fail as a result. Okay, design exercise time. I want to split us up into 4 groups.
Can I ask a question?
Totally.
Before? I know
Yes,
what-
everyone jump in with
I know
questions.
what you're doing is really big picture on a world scale, and you're using the petal and the metaphors of permaculture. Have you looked, and maybe that's a think take with your skills of activism and IT. I'm particularly interested in the energy of money, of scaling it so that the grant is a seed, but then it nurtures so that sustainability succession is the outcome as part of the yield. So what I'm saying is through that supply chain, as you're saying, everybody gets a slice of the pie, a little bit of yield. You've got a brilliant brain, you're going on to other projects.
But I mean, that's the question, isn't it? The reason I'm doing this here is because permaculture is one of the best tools in the world that is not scaled.
Correct.
Right, that has failed every time it's been used on really large scale farms, for different reasons, I know some of them, that has failed to scale to everybody in a suburb. Well, Retro Suburbia is a fabulous book. The systems work. We all know the systems work. So why isn't everybody using them? Because we're not thinking about how to take permaculture to scale. And internationally, it's not used that much. I mean, I work in international development. I see it happening. I see people inspired by it. It's not really used as nearly as much as it should be. The end point is impacting millions of people. I was lucky. I had a mentor, a guy called Paul Pollack. Does anyone know who he was? Okay, so he started an organisation called IDE, which Pollack, P-O-L-A-K, like Paul Pole, and he developed an organisation to do treadle pumps. Now, I met him at a conference once, and someone had made a presentation, and at question time, he asked the question. He said, "How many people will you impact?" And let's be clear. I'm not asking you how many are you impacting. I'm asking you how many will you impact if you're successful. And if it's not 10 million people, why are you wasting our time?
Wow.
I started.
And again, this goes out, but it also, this system that you've worked out with the lights, through Kiva loans, which is a banking thing where you put money in and it's,
Yeah.
the money's group. I think I've helped fund one of those, so, and then I think they've picked up. it sounds
Well,
like
we
it's-
talked to Kiva.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
so
we
they
worked with
work.
Kiva on some of the.
So they do big scale with everyone
Yeah.
putting into.
Well, we
it, so-
talked with Kiva because what they were doing was all these tiny loans for individuals,
Yeah, big
which
ones
didn't
too.
work, and we started working with them on the idea of big loans. We didn't do one with them, but we were working with them on the scheme. And you know, again, this is like the generosity in those kind of spaces is. It doesn't matter whether they do it with other people or with us, right? We're working with them to try and solve a problem. The problem is people not having light. The problem isn't us not having enough
Well,
service.
they took them on board because some of them are
Yeah.
huge ones.
Well, yes, I say it didn't come from us, but we worked with them on it. We were one of a couple of organisations that worked with them. Because their problem was how do you manage that, those loans at scale? And we and another company had the technology for doing that. Talking about is to say, so someone, volunteer who's got a project. Okay, Mum, what's your project again? Just one line.
trail, spreading it.
Garden trails. So the question, right, so then you ask the question, what would that look like if it was 10 times as big as it is now? What would be the same and what would be different about it? Right? How might that look if it was 10 times as big as it is now?
Every garden, every home in Australia would have an edible piece. And it wouldn't have to be permaculture. I think one of the problems with permaculture is it's too difficult. So the edible garden trail, as it started in the Blue Mountains, which is now around Australia, it's starting to grow, is about getting to people who don't understand permaculture or even organic growing.
Right.
And it's how do they peer into someone else's garden and find out how they're doing? Oh, that looks easy. I'll try that.
And one of which is different things. Right, so if we were looking at a food forest, this out here might be a forest, and here it might be seedlings with a ground cover, right? And then we would say, okay, mulch. How would we do it? How would we do it at this stage? Right? How would we do mulch at the stage where we've got seedlings and ground cover?
Pea straw.
Sorry?
Pea straw.
Pea straw. Where would we
Something
get?
easy to break down.
Right. And so then we ask the question, what's our supply chain? Excuse my crappy handwriting. Like, where do we get pea straw? Right? And then up here, mulch when we're a forest is chop and drop. Right? So you see, we're looking at problems over scale. If anyone's got a problem who's willing to volunteer, we'll work on yours.
Interesting.